They have felt it their entire life, the sense of being different, of not quite fitting, of carrying something others do not carry. Religious people call it being chosen by God, call it divine election, call it special calling, and they wonder, is this real? Is this spiritual delusion? Is this ego inflation disguised as religious experience? Carl Jung studied this phenomenon for decades, worked with patients who felt chosen, who experienced what they described as divine calling. And he discovered something profound. These people were not delusional, were not experiencing ego inflation. They were experiencing the beginning of what he called individuation, the psychological process of becoming whole. And the signs they interpreted as divine election were actually psychological markers, symptoms of psyche preparing for transformation that most people never undergo. Jung identified 7 specific signs, 7 experiences that indicate the soul has been activated for deep work, for the journey from ego consciousness to self-realization, from fragmentation to wholeness, from unconscious living to conscious being. But Jung understood something crucial that religious interpretation misses. Being chosen is not about being special in the sense of better than others. It is about being called to difficult work, to psychological suffering, to transformation that requires everything. Most people are not chosen precisely because most people are not willing to pay the price, are not willing to descend into darkness, are not willing to die to ego, are not willing to confront shadow, are not willing to sacrifice comfortable unconsciousness for painful consciousness. So when someone experiences the 7 signs Jung identified, they are not being told they are superior. They are being told they are ready. Ready for the work that destroys who you think you are so you can become who you actually are. Ready for what Jung called the individuation process, what mystics call dark night of the soul, what religious traditions describe as being chosen by God for special purpose. The danger Jung recognized is that people who experience these signs often inflate, believe they are spiritually superior, believe they have special status, believe God has chosen them over others. And this inflation prevents the very work the signs are indicating must be done, because individuation requires ego death, not ego inflation, requires humility, not superiority, requires recognizing that being chosen is not privilege, but responsibility, not honor, but burden. Not being elevated above others, but being called to serve consciousness evolution in ways that will cost you everything comfortable, everything familiar, everything you currently identify as yourself. So when they recognize the 7 signs in themselves, they must hold this paradox. Yes, something is activating. Yes, a calling is present. But the calling is not to feel special. The calling is to do the work. The difficult, painful, transformative work that most refuse, that most are not ready for, that these signs indicate they are being prepared to undertake. Today they are going to see the 7 signs Jung identified, the sacred restlessness that nothing external satisfies, the compulsion towards solitude that society calls antisocial, the pattern of suffering that seems disproportionate to others' experience, the synchronicities that defy statistical probability, the questions that never stop, that challenge everything, the overwhelming sense of responsibility for others' well-being, and the direct encounters with what Jung called the numinous, the experience of something greater that cannot be explained rationally. These 7 signs appear in people who are being activated for individuation, who are being called, in religious language, by God, who are being prepared, in psychological language, for the journey from ego to self. Look at these 7 signs, not to confirm you are special, but to understand what is being asked of you, what transformation is trying to happen, what work you are being called to do, because if you have these signs and refuse the work, they will torture you. Will create perpetual restlessness, isolation, suffering, confusion. But if you have these signs and accept the work, they will guide you, will show you the path, will be the markers indicating you are moving correctly through the territory of transformation. Make your choice. Which sign speaks to them, and then stay. Because what comes next will not inflate their ego. It will show them why Jung believed these signs indicate not divine favoritism, but psychological readiness for the most difficult and most important work a human being can do, the work of becoming whole. If they recognize the first sign, the sacred restlessness, the perpetual sense that something is missing no matter what they achieve or acquire, they have identified what Jung considered the primary indicator of being chosen for individuation. They have everything society says should make them happy: success, relationships, comfort, security. But underneath, there is emptiness, hunger, restlessness that nothing external touches. And religious people call this being chosen because the soul is hungry for God. But Jung understood it differently. This restlessness is the self, the archetypal center of wholeness, refusing to let ego remain satisfied with partial life, with surface existence, with comfortable unconsciousness. The restlessness is psyche demanding transformation, demanding depth, demanding the journey from ego identification to self-realization. If this is their sign, they are not cursed with perpetual dissatisfaction. They are being called to work that transcends external achievement. They developed this restlessness early. Maybe childhood felt empty despite having what they needed. Maybe adolescence was marked by sense that everyone else seemed satisfied with things that left them hungry. Maybe adulthood brought external success that felt internally meaningless, and they tried to satisfy the hunger, tried new relationships, new careers, new possessions, new experiences, and nothing worked. Nothing touched the deep hunger, and they concluded something is wrong with them. They are ungrateful, are never satisfied, are perpetually chasing something they cannot name. But Jung saw this differently, saw that this restlessness is not pathology, is calling, is the self refusing to let ego remain asleep, refusing to let them waste their life on pursuits that do not serve their actual development, refusing to let them stay comfortable when they are meant to transform. In Jungian terms, this is the self constellating, the archetype of wholeness activating, creating tension between where ego is and where self is trying to lead. And that tension manifests as restlessness, as sense that nothing is quite right, as perpetual feeling that something important is missing. Most people never experience this with such intensity. They find satisfaction in external achievements, find meaning in roles and relationships, find fulfillment in pursuits that ego values, and they live their entire life without the sacred restlessness, without the calling, without being chosen for transformation. They are not less than those who experience restlessness. They are simply not activated for individuation, are living a different path, a path that does not require the descent into depths, the confrontation with shadow, the death of ego, the rebirth as self. But for those who carry the sacred restlessness, there is no peace in external achievement, no satisfaction in ego pursuits, no fulfillment in anything that does not touch the depths. And this is the first sign they have been chosen, not by external God arbitrarily selecting them, but by their own psyche, by the self demanding attention, demanding transformation, demanding that they stop seeking satisfaction externally and begin the journey inward, that they stop trying to fill the hunger with more experiences, more achievements, more relationships, and start doing the work that actually addresses the hunger. The work of making unconscious conscious, of integrating shadow, of developing inferior functions, of dying to ego identification, of being reborn as integrated self. This is what the restlessness is calling them toward. This is what being chosen actually means. Breaking free from the torture of sacred restlessness requires accepting its message. They must stop trying to satisfy it externally, must recognize that no achievement, no relationship, no experience will touch it, must understand that the hunger is not for more, is for depth, is for transformation, is for the journey Jung mapped as individuation. The restlessness will not disappear, but it will transform, will stop being torture and become guide, will stop being curse and become compass, will show them when they are moving toward wholeness and when they are pursuing ego satisfactions that will ultimately leave them empty. This is the first sign, the sacred restlessness, the perpetual hunger, the sense that something is missing, and if they have it, they have been chosen, not for ease, for work, not for comfort, for transformation, not for feeling special, for becoming whole. If they recognize the second sign, the deep need for solitude that others misunderstand as antisocial behavior or depression, they have identified what Jung understood as essential requirement for individuation work. They need to be alone, not occasionally, regularly, extensively, and social pressure makes them feel guilty about this, makes them believe something is wrong with them, makes them force themselves into social situations that drain them, exhaust them, leave them feeling fragmented. But the need for solitude is not pathology, is not avoidance, is not depression. It is the psyche requiring space for inner work, for the kind of reflection, contemplation, and engagement with unconscious material that cannot happen in noise and social demand. If this is their sign, they are not antisocial. They are being called to work that requires withdrawing from external stimulation to access internal depths. They noticed this need early. Maybe as child, they preferred solitary play. Maybe as teenager, they felt exhausted by social events others enjoyed. Maybe as adult, they discovered that their energy depletes in groups and restores in solitude. And society told them this is wrong, that humans are social creatures, that isolation is unhealthy, that they should push through discomfort and engage more socially. So they tried, forced themselves into friendships, into social activities, into maintaining connections that felt draining. And they wondered why they felt constantly exhausted, why they needed days to recover from social interactions others found energizing, why being alone felt more natural, more restful, more real than being with people. And they concluded they are broken, are failing at being human, are somehow deficient in social capacity. But Jung understood this differently, understood that people called to individuation require extended solitude, require withdrawal from external demands to turn inward, require space free from social noise to hear the quiet voice of the self, require aloneness to do the work of active imagination, dream analysis, shadow integration, and engagement with archetypal material that constitutes individuation. This is not antisocial behavior. This is spiritual practice, is psychological necessity, is the chosen soul creating conditions necessary for transformation. Most people do not need this level of solitude, can develop adequately through social engagement, can find meaning through relationships and external activities, but those chosen for deeper work require different conditions, require the kind of extended aloneness that society pathologizes, but that Jung recognized as essential. The compulsion towards solitude serves specific functions. It removes them from collective consciousness so they can access individual consciousness, removes them from social roles so they can encounter authentic self beneath persona, removes them from external stimulation so they can perceive internal movements, removes them from other people's energy so they can sense their own. And in solitude, if they use it correctly, transformation happens. Dreams become clearer, intuitions become stronger. The voice of the self becomes audible. The work of integrating unconscious material becomes possible. This is why they are driven towards solitude, not because they dislike people, but because they are being prepared for work that requires depth access, that requires turning inward in ways impossible in social noise. Breaking free from guilt about solitude requires reframing it. They must recognize that their need for aloneness is not antisocial tendency, is spiritual practice, is psychological necessity, is response to the calling Jung identified as individuation. They must stop forcing themselves into social situations that fragment them and start honoring their need for solitary time. Must create regular, protected periods of aloneness. Must use that time not for distraction, but for inner work, for journaling, for active imagination, for sitting with themselves, for listening to what emerges from depths when external noise stops. And as they do this, as they honor the compulsion towards solitude instead of fighting it, they will discover that the time alone is not isolation, is communion, not with other people, with self, with the depths of their own psyche, with what Jung called the God image within. This is the second sign, the need for solitude, the requirement for aloneness, the withdrawal from social demands. And if they have it, they have been chosen not to be lonely, but to go deep. Not to avoid people, but to encounter depths that social life prevents accessing. Not to be antisocial, but to do work that requires solitude as essential condition. If they recognize the third sign, the pattern of suffering that seems excessive compared to what others experience, they have identified what Jung considered the crucible of individuation. They have suffered more than makes sense, more than seems fair: loss, betrayal, illness, crisis, experiences that would break most people. And they have endured multiple rounds, not once, repeatedly, and they wonder, why me? What did I do to deserve this? Is this punishment? But Jung understood suffering differently, understood that those chosen for deep transformation must be forged in fire, must be broken down completely so they can be rebuilt differently, must experience pain that destroys ego identification so self can emerge. If this is their sign, they are not being punished. They are being prepared, being shaped, being transformed through suffering into something ego alone could never become. They look at their life and see pattern: childhood trauma that others did not experience, adolescent losses that shaped them profoundly, adult crises that came in waves, and they tried to understand it, tried to make sense of why their life seems harder than others, tried to figure out what they are doing wrong that creates this pattern. But Jung saw that suffering is not random for those chosen for individuation, is not bad luck, is not divine punishment, is the psyche using crisis to force transformation, using loss to break ego attachment, using pain to open depths that comfort keeps closed, using suffering to prepare them for work that requires strength forged only through fire. Most people experience normal suffering, normal losses, normal challenges, and they develop normally. But those chosen for extraordinary transformation require extraordinary preparation, require suffering that breaks them open in ways comfort never could. In Jungian psychology, this is what he called the dark night of the soul, the necessary descent, the death that precedes rebirth. And it is not metaphorical, it is actual psychological death. Death of ego identification, death of who they thought they were, death of comfortable unconsciousness. And this death is painful, is crisis, is the suffering they have experienced repeatedly. Each round breaking down another layer of ego, another false identification, another comfortable illusion, until what remains is raw, authentic, stripped of all pretense. And from that rawness, self can emerge, can be born, can become conscious. This is why they have suffered disproportionately, not because they are cursed, because they are being prepared for transformation that most people are not chosen for, precisely because they could not survive the preparation. The pattern of suffering also serves another function. It develops compassion, develops capacity to hold pain, their own and others, develops understanding of human darkness that those who live comfortable lives never access. develops strength that comes not from never falling, but from rising repeatedly, develops wisdom that comes only through lived experience of depths. And these qualities, compassion, capacity to hold pain, understanding of darkness, resilient strength, experiential wisdom, are precisely what is required for the work they are being prepared to do. Work that involves helping others through their own darkness, holding space for others' transformation, being guide for those beginning individuation journey, being, in religious language, shepherd for souls in crisis. This is why they suffered, to develop capacity to serve others' suffering without being destroyed by it. Breaking free from resentment about suffering requires reframing it. They must stop seeing it as punishment and start seeing it as preparation. Must recognize that every crisis served purpose. Every loss broke necessary attachment. Every pain opened necessary depth. They must actively work with their suffering instead of just surviving it. Must ask, what is this breaking in me? What is this opening? What is this preparing me for? Must integrate the lessons instead of just enduring the pain. Must allow the transformation suffering is trying to create instead of resisting it. And as they do this work, as they consciously engage their suffering as crucible for transformation, something shifts. The pain does not disappear, but meaning emerges, purpose becomes clear, and they recognize that they were not suffering randomly. We're suffering as part of being shaped, being forged, being prepared. This is the third sign: disproportionate suffering, excessive pain, pattern of crisis. And if they have experienced it, they have been chosen not for easy life, but for transformative work. Not for comfort, but for depth. Not for avoiding pain, but for using pain as teacher, as guide, as crucible that prepares them for work most people will never be asked to do because they could not survive the preparation it requires. If they recognize the fourth sign, the experience of synchronicities so frequent and precise they cannot be dismissed as coincidence, they have identified what Jung considered direct evidence of psyche's connection to something greater. They think of someone and that person contacts them. They need guidance and the perfect book appears. They question something and the answer arrives through seemingly random encounter. And this happens not occasionally, but regularly, with precision that defies probability, with meaning that cannot be explained rationally. And Jung discovered that people in individuation process experience intensified synchronicity, not because they are more special, but because they are more conscious, more aware, more attuned to the meaningful connections between inner psychological state and outer events. If this is their sign, they are not imagining patterns. They are perceiving real connections that most people miss because most people are not conscious enough to recognize them. They started noticing these synchronicities at some point. Maybe childhood, when they had premonitions that came true. Maybe adolescence, when meaningful coincidences guided important decisions. Maybe adulthood, when the pattern became undeniable, and they tried to explain it rationally, tried to dismiss it as confirmation bias. Tried to convince themselves it is just coincidence, just statistical probability playing out, but the experiences kept coming, too frequent, too precise, too meaningful to dismiss. And they started wondering, is this divine guidance? Is this proof of God? Is this evidence of something beyond material reality? And Jung would say, yes, but not in the way religious doctrine teaches. Synchronicity is evidence that psyche is not contained by skull, that there is dimension of reality where inner and outer connect, where meaning operates, where what he called the collective unconscious interfaces with material world. Jung spent decades studying synchronicity, documenting cases that could not be explained by causality, and he concluded that there is a causal connecting principle, a dimension of reality where things connect through meaning rather than cause and effect. And people in individuation process, people being chosen in religious language, experience this dimension more intensely. not because it is not always operating, but because their consciousness has developed enough to perceive it. Most people live entirely in causal reality, explain everything through cause and effect, miss the meaningful connections, miss the synchronicities, miss the evidence that consciousness extends beyond individual skull. But those chosen for transformation develop capacity to perceive both causality and acausality, both physical reality and meaningful reality, both outer events and inner psychological significance of those events. And this dual awareness is what creates the experience of frequent synchronicity. The intensification of synchronicities during individuation serves purpose. It confirms that the work is happening, that psyche is transforming, that consciousness is expanding, that connection to self and through self to collective unconscious is strengthening. Each synchronicity is evidence that they are on path, that transformation is progressing, that the calling they sensed is real, and the synchronicities also guide. Show them when they are aligned and when they are straying. Show them which direction to move. Show them what requires attention. Show them connections they would miss through rational thought alone. This is why people chosen for transformation experience synchronicity intensely, not as supernatural phenomenon, as natural result of consciousness expanding enough to perceive the meaningful dimension of reality that always exists, but that most people never access. Breaking free from doubt about synchronicities requires honoring them. They must stop dismissing meaningful coincidences as chance, must start recording them, must notice patterns, must trust that when synchronicity occurs, something significant is being communicated. They must learn to read synchronicities as language, as messages from unconscious, as guidance from self, as evidence that they are not alone in transformation process, that something greater, whether they call it God, self, collective unconscious, or simply the meaningful dimension of reality, is participating, is guiding, is confirming they are moving correctly through territory of transformation. And as they learn this language, as they become fluent in reading synchronicity, their path becomes clearer, their choices become more aligned, their life becomes more meaningful, because they are no longer operating only from ego consciousness, trying to figure everything out rationally. They are operating from self-consciousness that perceives meaning, follows guidance, trusts the process. This is the fourth sign: frequent synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. Events that connect inner and outer in ways probability cannot explain. And if they experience this, they have been chosen not to receive supernatural favors, but to develop consciousness advanced enough to perceive dimension of reality most people never access, to operate from meaning as well as causality, to be guided by self as well as ego, to participate consciously in transformation that synchronicity confirms is happening. Now that they have seen 4 of the 7 signs, sacred restlessness, compulsion towards solitude, disproportionate suffering, frequent synchronicity, it is time to integrate what Jung discovered these signs actually mean. They are not arbitrary marks of divine favoritism. They are psychological symptoms, symptoms of psyche activating for individuation, for the journey from unconscious to conscious, from ego identification to self-realization, from fragmentation to wholeness. And understanding this changes everything, because if being chosen by God is actually psychological calling to individuation, then the response required is not religious performance, is psychological work, is the difficult daily practice of making unconscious conscious, of integrating shadow, of developing inferior functions, of dying to ego, of being reborn as self. This is what being chosen actually demands. Jung spent his career mapping this process, showing that what mystics call divine calling and what psychologists call individuation are the same phenomenon described in different languages. The mystic says God is calling them to transformation. The psychologist says self is demanding consciousness development, same experience, different framework. And Jung bridged these frameworks, showed that religious experience and psychological experience are not separate, that the God image in psyche and the self are functionally identical. That being chosen by God and being called to individuation are describing same activation, same process, same transformation. And this integration allows people to honor their experience without requiring literal religious interpretation, allows them to recognize that something real is happening without needing to believe in external deity arbitrarily selecting them. The 7 signs work together. The restlessness creates motivation for journey. The solitude creates conditions for inner work. The suffering creates necessary ego death. The synchronicities provide confirmation and guidance. And the remaining 3 signs, which they will see next, complete the picture. Together, these 7 experiences indicate that psyche has been activated, that self is demanding attention, that individuation is beginning whether ego wants it or not, and the person has choice. They can resist, can try to return to comfortable unconsciousness, can ignore the signs and attempt normal life. But resistance creates pathology, creates neurosis, creates the symptoms Jung observed in patients who were called to transformation but refused the call: depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, addiction, relationship dysfunction, chronic illness. These are not random afflictions. They are what happens when psyche demands transformation and ego refuses. But if they accept the calling, if they recognize the signs and begin the work, something different happens. The symptoms do not disappear immediately. The restlessness remains but transforms into drive. The need for solitude becomes sacred practice. The suffering becomes meaningful. The synchronicities become guidance, and new capacities emerge. Capacity to hold opposites, capacity to tolerate ambiguity, capacity to remain conscious when most people dissociate, capacity to serve others' transformation because they have undergone their own. This is what being chosen actually produces. Not elevated status, not spiritual superiority, but psychological wholeness that allows them to live differently, to relate differently, to work differently, to serve differently, to be, in religious language, salt and light, to be, in psychological language, individuated enough to help collective consciousness evolve. And here is what Jung understood that religious teaching often misses. Being chosen is not permanent state, is ongoing process. Individuation is not achieved once and maintained forever, is work that continues. Each new life stage brings new challenges, new shadow material, new opportunities for consciousness development. So the 7 signs are not just markers of initial calling, they are ongoing indicators. When restlessness returns, more transformation is required. When need for solitude intensifies, deeper work is calling. When new suffering arrives, new ego death is necessary. When synchronicities increase, new guidance is being offered. The signs continue throughout life for those who accepted calling. Continue indicating where work is needed. Continue showing path through ongoing transformation. This is what being chosen means. Not one-time selection, ongoing participation in consciousness evolution that requires everything and never stops demanding more. Now they must see the final 3 signs Jung identified. The 5th sign is relentless questioning. They cannot accept answers others find sufficient, cannot believe doctrines others accept without examination, cannot stop asking why, what if, what else, what really. And this drives others crazy, makes them seem difficult, skeptical, never satisfied. But Jung recognized this questioning as essential sign of being chosen for transformation. Because individuation requires questioning everything ego accepts, requires examining every belief, every assumption, every inherited framework. requires becoming conscious of what was unconscious, and that requires questions. Relentless, uncomfortable, never-ending questions. If they have this, they have been chosen not for comfortable certainty, but for uncomfortable truth-seeking. The sixth sign is overwhelming sense of responsibility for others. They feel other people's pain, feel responsible for helping, feel guilty when they cannot fix everyone's problems. And psychologically healthy people tell them this is codependency. Tell them they need boundaries, tell them they cannot save everyone, and they are right. But Jung recognized that for those chosen for transformation, this sense of cosmic responsibility is different, is not codependency, is recognition that they are being prepared for work that serves collective consciousness, that their individuation is not just personal, is contribution to collective, is part of evolution of human consciousness. And this recognition creates sense of responsibility that transcends personal relationships. They feel responsible not just for people they know, but for consciousness itself, for truth, for helping others wake up. This is not pathology. This is calling. This is being chosen to serve transformation at collective level. The seventh sign is direct encounter with the numinous. They have experienced something they cannot explain rationally, something that felt wholly terrifying, overwhelming, transformative, maybe through psychedelic experience, maybe through meditation, maybe through crisis, maybe through dream, maybe through nature. But they encountered something greater, something that Jung called the numinous, something that religious people call God, something that changed them fundamentally, and they can never go back to believing reality is just material, can never return to purely rational framework, can never unknow what they experienced. This is the final sign, direct encounter with what transcends ego. And if they have had this experience, they have been chosen not to believe in God abstractly, but to know God experientially, not to have faith, to have gnosis, to have direct knowing that cannot be argued away or explained away or forgotten. These final three signs complete the seven, and together they paint clear picture of person whose psyche has been activated for deep transformation, who cannot return to comfortable unconsciousness, who cannot live surface life, who cannot avoid the work of individuation, and they have choice. They can resist, can try to return to normal, can ignore calling and suffer consequences, neurosis, meaninglessness, pathology, or they can accept, can begin work, can start daily practices that respond to calling. And Jung provided those practices. The first practice is shadow work, daily examination of what they project onto others, what they judge, what they reject in themselves, and owning it, integrating it, bringing rejected parts back into consciousness. The second practice is active imagination, daily engagement with unconscious material, sitting quietly, allowing images to arise, dialoguing with them, learning language of unconscious. The third practice is dream work, recording dreams, working with symbols, letting unconscious communicate through images. The fourth practice is developing inferior functions, identifying which of the four functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, they suppress, and consciously developing them. The fifth practice is holding tension of opposites, not collapsing into one-sided positions, learning to contain paradox, to be both, and instead of either or. The sixth practice is conscious suffering, not avoiding pain, but working with it, asking what it is teaching, what it is transforming, what it is preparing. The seventh practice is honoring synchronicity, recording meaningful coincidences, following guidance, trusting that when meaning appears, something significant is being communicated. These seven practices respond to seven signs, transform symptoms into pathway, transform calling into work, transform being chosen into becoming whole. And this is what Jung offered, not religious doctrine about divine election, but psychological map for responding to activation, for doing work that signs indicate must be done, for fulfilling potential that being chosen represents. They have signs. Now they need practices, have calling. Now they need response, have been chosen. Now they need to choose back, to choose transformation, to choose consciousness, to choose individuation. This is what being chosen actually requires. They have walked through all 7 signs today. Sacred restlessness, compulsion towards solitude, pattern of disproportionate suffering, frequent synchronicity, relentless questioning, overwhelming sense of responsibility, direct encounter with numinous. And if they recognize themselves in these signs, they now know what Jung discovered. They have been chosen, not by external God playing favorites, but by their own psyche, by the self-demanding consciousness, by the evolutionary imperative toward wholeness that most people never hear, but that some cannot ignore. They have been activated for individuation, for transformation, for the journey from ego to self, from unconsciousness to consciousness, from fragmentation to wholeness. And this is simultaneously gift and burden, privilege and responsibility, calling and demand. Carl Jung devoted his life to mapping this territory, to showing that being chosen is not religious fantasy, is psychological reality, is activation of individuation process that can be observed, mapped, facilitated. And he offered something revolutionary. You do not have to interpret your experience through religious framework. Do not have to believe in literal divine election. Do not have to accept any doctrine. You can understand being chosen psychologically, can recognize it as self-demanding attention, as psyche activating for transformation, as consciousness evolution selecting you not because you are superior, but because you are ready. Ready for work most refuse, ready for suffering most avoid, ready for transformation most cannot survive. And this reframing changes everything, removes ego inflation, removes spiritual superiority, removes religious performance, and leaves only the work, the daily, difficult, transformative work of individuation. But Jung also warned about what happens if they ignore the signs, if they recognize the calling but refuse to respond, if they try to return to normal life, to comfortable unconsciousness, to ego-identified existence. The signs do not disappear, they intensify. Restlessness becomes unbearable, solitude becomes isolation, suffering becomes pathology, synchronicities become haunting, questions become torment, responsibility becomes crushing, numinous encounters become terrifying, and neurosis develops, depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, addiction. The symptoms Jung observed in every patient who was called to transformation but refused the call, because psyche will not be denied, self will not be ignored. Individuation will happen, or neurosis will happen. There is no third option. No way to go back to sleep once you've been awakened. No way to return to unconsciousness once consciousness has begun demanding attention. Which signs did they recognize? All 7? Some? Even one is significant. Even one indicates activation, indicates calling, indicates they have been chosen for work most people never do. And having recognized the signs, what will they do? Will they dismiss this as spiritual fantasy? Will they inflate and believe they are specially chosen while doing no actual work? Or will they accept the calling and begin the practices? Will they do shadow work, active imagination, dream work, function development, holding opposites, conscious suffering, honoring synchronicity? Will they respond to being chosen by choosing back, by choosing transformation over comfort, by choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, by choosing the difficult path of individuation over the easy path of ego-identified existence? Share which signs they recognized. Their honesty might help someone else recognize their own calling. Subscribe to continue this work of understanding individuation through Jungian lens. 2 more videos appearing now. Choose one. Until they meet again, remember this. Being chosen by God is not religious doctrine requiring belief. Is psychological reality requiring response. The 7 signs are not supernatural marks, are natural symptoms of psyche activating for transformation. And transformation is not passive event, is active work. Daily practices, conscious choices, difficult confrontations, painful deaths, transformative rebirths. Jung showed that those who are chosen, who have the 7 signs, are not better than others, are not more loved by God, are simply activated for different work, deeper work, harder work. Work that serves not just personal growth, but collective consciousness evolution. Work that makes them capable of helping others transform because they have undergone transformation themselves. This is what being chosen actually means, not elevated status, not divine favoritism, but calling to serve consciousness evolution through personal individuation, through becoming whole, through doing inner work that makes outer work possible. The signs have appeared. The calling is clear, and response is required. Not belief, not worship, not religious performance, but work. The daily, difficult, transformative work of individuation, of making unconscious conscious, of integrating shadow, of dying to ego, of being reborn as self. This is what being chosen demands, and it is waiting.